Welcome to the Real Free News audio podcast. Today, we explore U.S. demographic and employment changes from the 1960s onward, focusing on policy impacts like immigration reforms and diversity initiatives on workforce opportunities, particularly for certain groups starting in the 1990s through recent decades. The transformation of the American labor market and demographic landscape over the latter half of the 20th century and into the 21st century reflects a series of policy-driven changes that profoundly altered opportunities for certain groups. Beginning with legislative reforms in the 1960s, these shifts introduced new dynamics in immigration and civil rights protections, which gradually intensified competition and restructured access to education, employment, and career advancement. By the 1990s, these elements coalesced into observable hardships for young white males entering the workforce, marking the onset of a broader pattern of exclusion that would escalate in subsequent decades. This period saw the maturation of immigrant populations and their offspring, alongside affirmative action and diversity initiatives that prioritized minorities and women, leading to a perceived erosion of traditional pathways for white Americans. In this context, the 1990s emerged as a pivotal decade where white males, particularly those pursuing higher education, encountered systemic barriers. Many completed college degrees without receiving essential support such as career counseling, academic advisement, mentorships, or internships, despite bearing the full financial burden of their education. Instead, resources were increasingly directed towards specialized programs for minorities and females, fostering an environment where white males were often overlooked or actively passed over in favor of underrepresented groups. This lack of assistance left graduates without clear professional trajectories, compelling them to seek alternative routes like commission-based sales positions, which offered independence but lacked the stability of corporate or government roles. These developments were not isolated but part of a cumulative process rooted in earlier policies, including the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act and civil rights measures that provided advantages to minorities. As the white-dominated job market of prior eras gave way to expanded inclusion efforts, older white workers adopted protective strategies, holding onto positions to avoid replacement and limiting opportunities for the next generation. The result was a workforce increasingly oriented toward diversity goals, where equality initiatives functioned as mechanisms for reallocating resources away from white males, setting the stage for more overt forms of discrimination in later years. Policy foundations and early demographic changes. The foundational policies that catalyzed profound shifts in the American demographic and labor landscape were enacted in the 1960s, fundamentally altering immigration patterns and civil rights protections. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 stands as a cornerstone, eliminating long-standing national origin quotas that had favored European immigrants and instead prioritizing family reunification and skill-based criteria. This legislative pivot opened avenues for substantial inflows from regions such as Latin America and Asia, initiating a slow but steady demographic expansion that integrated newcomers into low-wage economic sectors. Over time, these immigrants not only filled immediate labor gaps but also established families, with their offspring receiving education and positioning themselves for broader market competition in subsequent decades. Simultaneously, civil rights laws of the era instituted protections intended to rectify historical inequities, yet they extended preferential advantages to minority groups including Blacks, Africans, and Latinos, often encompassing individuals from undocumented backgrounds. These measures, while framed as corrective justice, laid the groundwork for initiatives that would later be perceived as disadvantaging the majority white population by reallocating opportunities and resources. As the 1970s unfolded, the initial effects of these 1960s reforms began to surface through a trickle of cheap labor contributing to modest economic expansion, though the deeper competitive tensions remained subdued and not fully realized. Immigrants and their growing families started to root themselves more firmly in American society, with population increases from these groups setting the stage for enhanced workforce participation in the years ahead. This period witnessed the gradual erosion of the organic white ethnic framework that had characterized the nation, where the population had been overwhelmingly white up until the mid-20th century. Civil rights advantages played a key role in facilitating the incorporation of minorities into various job sectors, allowing for their integration without immediate widespread displacement of white workers. However, this subtle shift began to challenge the traditional job marketplace dynamics, where career progressions had historically occurred within a predominantly white context, fostering a nascent undercurrent of competition that would intensify as minority populations expanded and gained traction through protective policies. By the 1980s, the repercussions of earlier policies grew more evident in targeted segments and geographic regions, although overarching economic prosperity often concealed a comprehensive national transformation. Illegal immigrants and burgeoning minority communities capitalized on emerging diversity initiatives, which provided them with footholds in the labor market and sparked localized job competition. White males in specific industries adopted protective stances, clinging to their positions to safeguard against potential replacement, yet this behavior was not yet pervasive across the entire country. Societal factors, including ongoing economic growth, permitted continued access for many whites in various areas, mitigating the sense of blanket exclusion that would characterize later periods. Nonetheless, this decade represented a bridge toward more uniform impacts, as the advantages afforded to minorities through civil rights frameworks began to manifest in tangible ways, subtly reshaping the employment landscape and preparing the ground for the overt challenges that white males would confront in the ensuing years. The 1990s. Emergence of systemic barriers for young white males. The 1990s marked a decisive turning point where young white males, particularly those emerging from college, encountered unprecedented systemic barriers that severely curtailed their access to job opportunities and educational support. Many pursued higher education with the expectation of professional guidance, yet they frequently navigated their academic journeys devoid of essential career assistance, such as structured interviews, mentorship programs, internships, or even basic academic advisement. Despite shouldering the full financial responsibilities of tuition and related costs, these individuals often graduated without any viable career plans or professional networks, compelled to improvise in a job market that seemed indifferent to their presence. This lack of institutional support arose from a deliberate redirection of resources, where universities and employers prioritized other demographics, leaving white males to fend for themselves in an increasingly competitive environment that favored alternative pathways over traditional stability. A proliferation of specialized university offices dedicated to minorities and females exacerbated these disparities, providing tailored recruitment, comprehensive counseling, and direct job placement services to groups like Latinos, Blacks, and women, often at the explicit expense of white males. These initiatives actively reached out to underrepresented populations, including those connected to illegal immigration, offering them advantages in enrollment, advisement, and employment transitions that were systematically withheld from whites. The absence of parallel structures for white students stemmed from perceptions that such efforts would be redundant or even discriminatory, creating profound imbalances in access to opportunities. When white males attempted to voice concerns over these inequities, their objections were routinely brushed aside as failures to grasp the imperatives of equality or as resistance to progressive principles, reinforcing a narrative that marginalized their experiences. Within the wider labor arena, affirmative action and burgeoning diversity initiatives further entrenched these barriers by shifting focus toward minorities and females, effectively blocking white males from entry into stable positions across corporate, government, and public sectors. Older white workers in authoritative roles often clung protectively to their jobs, refraining from hiring younger counterparts to avoid intensifying competition amid requirements to include underrepresented groups. Practices like group interviews for conventionally male-dominated roles were adapted to fulfill diversity quotas, constricting available spots and compelling white leaders to champion females and minorities over extending similar opportunities within their own group. This era's dynamics, widespread from central regions to coastal areas, disguised exclusionary tactics as equitable advancements, profoundly impacting young white males who were forced into less secure avenues like commission-driven sales, where personal effort supplanted institutional backing. Escalation in the 2000s, overt hostility and increased competition. The 2000s represented a significant intensification of the patterns established in the previous decade, where diversity efforts evolved into more structured inclusion frameworks that fostered overt hostility toward white males in various professional settings. Affirmative action, while gradually falling out of favor in name, was supplanted by alternative terminology and programs that perpetuated similar disadvantages, ensuring that job market expansions primarily benefited minorities and females. Latino populations experienced a notable surge during this period, driven by ongoing immigration and the maturation of offspring from earlier waves, who now entered the workforce in greater numbers. Industries across sectors began prioritizing their incorporation, viewing it as alignment with emerging equity goals, which further amplified competition for roles traditionally accessible to white males. This shift was not merely incidental but reflected a deliberate reorientation of corporate and public hiring practices, where stability and advancement opportunities were increasingly reserved for underrepresented groups, leaving white males to navigate a landscape marked by reduced prospects and heightened scrutiny. White males who had initiated their careers in the 1990s encountered persistent barriers in advancing to significant positions, particularly within corporate and public domains, as equality initiatives continued to reshape organizational priorities. The decade witnessed a profound reshuffling of employment allocations, with stable and prestigious roles being systematically directed toward minorities and women, thereby exacerbating feelings of exclusion and marginalization. Attempts to confront or mitigate these dynamics were frequently met with entrenched resistance, often couched in generational propaganda that portrayed assistance to others as an unquestionable moral duty, without delving into the potential long-term consequences. Such narratives, disseminated through media and institutional channels, reinforced the notion that any opposition stemmed from a lack of empathy or progressiveness, effectively silencing critiques and perpetuating the cycle of disadvantage. This era also illuminated the pivotal role of white enablers, encompassing liberals and others swayed by pervasive media influences and the infiltration of anti-white ideologies into key institutions, who actively endorsed policies that facilitated these measures. Their support, driven by ideals of liberation and savior complexes, contributed to the normalization of anti-white initiatives, allowing them to gain further traction without substantial pushback. The cumulative effect was a marked decline in mentorships and intergenerational opportunities, as established white workers prioritized self-preservation in the face of mounting minority advantages, refraining from extending guidance or positions to younger counterparts. This protective stance, combined with the broader societal emphasis on diversity, resulted in a workforce where white males were increasingly sidelined, setting the foundation for even more pronounced exclusions in the following decades. The 2010s, flood of immigration and DEI dominance. In the 2010s, the competitive pressures in the labor market reached new heights with a flood of immigration facilitated by H-1B visas and expanded student admissions, introducing skilled workers from India and other regions who visibly displaced incumbents in technology and professional fields. DEI programs rose to prominence as overarching forces, implementing overt exclusionary practices that led to statistical dominance in job gains for minorities and women at the direct expense of white males. White females also started to feel the repercussions, increasingly displaced by minority females, especially those from Latino backgrounds tied to illegal immigration and their descendants, as the focus shifted toward broader underrepresented representation. This acceleration marked a discernible escalation from earlier patterns, where the integration of foreign talent became apparent to many observers, highlighting a manipulated societal framework that prioritized demographic diversification over established equity. The influx of more admissions and illegal entrants further intensified the exclusionary trends across all white demographics, with influences from critical race theory amplifying perceptions of systemic discrimination. Foreign students and visa holders advanced rapidly, making the replacement dynamics evident in real-time workplace reshufflings, where positions were reassigned in ways that underscored the prescience of earlier white male observations about unfairness. The decade's societal elements revealed underlying manipulations, where policies were framed as progressive necessities but functioned to disadvantage traditional groups without transparent justification. Generational propaganda persisted in dismissing valid concerns, portraying inclusions as indispensable for societal equity while sidestepping discussions on their benefits or potential drawbacks, thereby maintaining the momentum of these shifts. This period served as a bridge of escalation from the 1990s foundations, with white males from preceding cohorts actively advocating for greater awareness as the patterns grew undeniable and pervasive. The dominance of DEI initiatives not only entrenched statistical exclusions, but also fostered an environment where overt discrimination became normalized under the guise of inclusion. As a result, the decade solidified the trajectory of workforce transformation, where the flood of non-traditional entrants compounded the challenges, paving the way for the apex of these issues in the subsequent years and prompting a growing recognition among affected individuals of the long-developing nature of these dynamics. The 2020s, apex of exclusion and emerging pushback. The 2020s culminated in the apex of exclusionary practices, characterized by massive illegal invasions alongside expansions in H-1B visas, green cards, and other immigration mechanisms that inundated the workforce with non-white individuals from global sources. Great replacement dynamics, as detailed in United Nations documents exploring migration as a means to counter aging and declining populations in developed nations, became overtly manifest, leading to widespread terminations and replacements of white workers across all sectors. White women, who had previously gained from anti-male practices originating in the 1990s, now encountered comparable discrimination at the hands of non-white women, underscoring the broader intent to displace white demographics entirely. This pinnacle represented the full realization of accumulated policies, where blatant abuses permeated government, public, and corporate realms, often in violation of existing anti-discrimination laws, but enabled by the sheer volume of minority populations advancing their own agendas. The build-up to this apex spanned over 50 years, tracing back to 1960s reforms and the establishment of advocacy groups that progressively institutionalized these shifts. Mid-decade developments in 2025 initiated a notable pushback, targeting the severe immigration frameworks that had disproportionately disadvantaged white males and, increasingly, white females. This response emerged after decades of unchecked escalation, reflecting a collective awakening to the overt power abuses and discriminatory excesses that had reached pandemonium levels. Historical perspective in this era validated the initial experiences of 1990s white males as the authentic starting point, with affected individuals from each decade recognizing the issue as a continuously developing phenomenon rather than a recent anomaly. Migration organizations and centuries-old demographic studies, spanning from the 1700s through the 2000s, reinforce these occurrences as deliberate planned replacements rather than mere conspiracies, providing an analytical framework for understanding the orchestrated nature of population dynamics. The validation extended to acknowledging that white men who had observed and articulated these patterns since the 1990s were correct all along, now joined by white women in observing the comprehensive impacts. This emerging pushback in the mid-2020s signifies a potential turning point, where the historical arc of exclusion is finally addressed, allowing for a reevaluation of the manipulative elements that had perpetuated these scams and schemes over generations. Conclusion: the discriminating 90s. Reflecting on the profound transformations that have reshaped the American labor market and demographic composition, the path from the 1960s legislative reforms to the apex of exclusion in the 2020s reveals a calculated reconfiguration of society driven by immigration policies and inclusion mandates. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, alongside civil rights protections, set in motion a gradual but relentless shift that prioritized family reunification and minority advantages, leading to increased competition from Latinos, Blacks, Africans, and later skilled immigrants from Asia. White males in the 1990s stood as the initial vanguard of this experience, bearing the brunt of overlooked opportunities where college educations yielded no interviews, mentorships, internships, or career guidance, as resources were systematically diverted to specialized programs for minorities and females. Their lived realities, emerging from higher education without networks or plans, forced into commission-based sales roles amid protective job holding by older whites, were frequently dismissed as misunderstandings or resistance to equality, yet they foreshadowed the broader societal impacts that would unfold. This decade's systemic blocking, disguised as progressive initiatives, marked the discernible onset of hardships, where affirmative action and diversity efforts began phasing out traditional white frameworks, creating vast discrepancies in access that many perceived as manipulated dynamics with ulterior motives rooted in generational propaganda. The facilitation of these shifts owed much to the involvement of white enablers, including liberals, saviors, and those influenced by media and institutional infiltration, who championed ideological and moral imperatives that allowed anti-white initiatives to flourish under the veneer of equality and Christian values of openness. These individuals, often brainwashed by pervasive narratives promoting help for others without scrutiny of consequences, voted for and supported policies that enabled the proliferation of civil rights scams, diversity schemes, and replacement migration ideas. As a result, the organic job marketplace, once 90% white and structured for intergenerational passing of opportunities, eroded, with stable corporate, government, and public roles increasingly allocated to minorities and females at the direct expense of white males. In later decades, white women, who had initially benefited from these anti-male practices in the 1990s, began encountering parallel exclusions, displaced by non-white women and highlighting the full scope of white replacement strategies. This recognition across generations underscores the need for a collective acknowledgement of how such enablers, through their well-intentioned but ultimately detrimental actions, perpetuated a system where attempts to highlight unfairness were met with accusations of discrimination, allowing the cumulative effects to build unchecked over 3 to 4 decades. Ultimately, the emerging pushback in the mid-2020s, particularly by 2025, provides a corrective lens through which the accuracy and essential nature of earlier observations can be affirmed, validating the experiences of white males from the 1990s onward as prescient warnings of a developing crisis. This historical arc, encompassing the trickle of cheap labor in the 1970s, segmental effects in the 1980s, overt hostility in the 2000s, DI dominance and immigration floods in the 2010s, and the pinnacle of blatant discrimination in the 2020s, emphasizes the imperative to address cumulative discriminations and restore truly equitable frameworks. By confronting the Great Replacement dynamics, evident in UN documents and long-standing demographic studies from centuries past, future generations can comprehend the origins and far-reaching implications of these profound changes, ensuring that the lessons from lived experiences prevent further manipulation and foster a society where opportunities are not reallocations based on anti-white agendas, but genuine progress for all. Addendum: leveraging anti-discrimination laws for recourse and reform. In light of the extensive demographic and employment transformations outlined in the main analysis, white males possess a viable pathway to reclaim lost ground by strategically employing the very anti-discrimination laws that have been wielded against them since the 1960s. These statutes, ostensibly designed to combat bias, have in reality perpetuated systemic discrimination against white Americans, channeling opportunities toward minorities and females while sidelining white males based on their racial identity. With the full extent of these exclusions laid bare, white men can invoke provisions like Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to file claims against employers, educational institutions, and government bodies that favored non-whites in hiring, promotions, and resource allocation. By emphasizing whiteness as the deciding factor in adverse decisions, where being white led to denial of interviews, mentorships, internships, and stable roles, litigants can argue that such practices constituted unlawful racial discrimination, demanding accountability from those who implemented diversity and inclusion mandates. This reversal allows white males to challenge the architects of these policies, seeking judicial remedies that expose the hypocrisy of laws meant to ensure fairness, but used to enforce anti-white agendas. The awakening among white males to this potential signifies a transformative moment, where the tools of exclusion can be redirected to achieve restitution and punishment for decades of abuse. Institutions that establish specialized offices for minorities while neglecting or blocking white students, or corporations that prioritize Latinos and blacks over whites in the 1990s and beyond, can face lawsuits highlighting whiteness as the prohibitive criterion that barred access to opportunities. Leveraging demographic superiority, stemming from historical population dominance and influence in legal systems, along with organizational prowess, white men can pursue coordinated efforts, including class action suits, to recover financial losses such as foregone earnings and benefits. The revenge element, inherent in human responses to prolonged injustice, motivates this pursuit, targeting individuals and groups who profited from these imbalances through exposure, fines, and reputational damage. While irretrievable elements like time cannot be restored, the focus on reclaiming jobs, finances, and positions serves to rectify tangible harms, turning the tables on forces that identified and exploited white vulnerabilities for their gain. This strategic application of supposedly anti-discrimination laws should function as an interim tactic, embodying the principle of turnabout as fair play, where white men exploit these frameworks for their benefit before pushing for their complete dismantlement. Once sufficient leverage is obtained to abolish the equality, diversity, and inclusion mandates that escalated from the 1990s into overt exclusion by the 2020s, the ultimate objective is to eliminate them entirely, eradicating coerced demographic shifts. By prioritizing whiteness as the deciding factor in legal arguments, white Americans can not only reverse the trajectory, but also punish the perpetrators, ensuring that advocacy groups, infiltrated institutions, and enablers face consequences for their roles. This addendum advocates for a proactive stance. Utilize all superiorities, demographic, methodological, and otherwise, to reclaim what was lost, exact revenge through structured means, and pave the way for a system unencumbered by these manipulative laws, restoring a landscape where white identity is no longer a liability, but a foundation for resurgence. Thank you for listening to the Real Free News Podcast. Be sure to like, share, subscribe, and tell us what you think in the comments section. Visit realfreenews.com for more Real Free News, and check out the Real Free News store for real free food and gear. Tune in again, and until then, remember to keep it real. Free news.
See you next time.